I'm coming from a place of, I've worked in film and television most of my career, and done a lot of writing, done produced and directed documentaries and stuff. And game development is actually the world where I've insinuated myself the least. So a lot of my concepts here, I've kind of come up with on my own, and I've had the least opportunity to explore them. So they kind of remain concepts. But as I watch games develop over the years, I start to see narrative expressing itself in really interesting ways in games. And I thought it was interesting earlier. It was Yves was saying he was looking at the different roles in game development, and he sort of brushed over one. He said, "There's a narrative designer too, whatever they do," and then he just kept talking. So it's starting to get a little bit of traction. I think some of those ideas are starting to permeate through. But when I first started sort of injecting this idea into the game world, I got a lot of pushback. I'll get into that in a bit, but some people really bristled at the idea of trying to tell a story through games. That was an idea that I think brings to mind things like cutscenes in video games and things that really just make the new medium look like it's trying to be the old medium, look like it's trying to be films or television or something like that. But I just want to introduce you first to the concept, and we'll see how it fits into the game world in a bit. So the concept comes from, started with one of the fathers of modern psychology, Carl Jung, when he was developing his concepts about the universal unconscious. So he was looking beyond just the personal unconscious, beyond what we experience consciously, then our unconscious world, and then what we as a species have in common way under everything else. What's written into our DNA. And as he was exploring this, he was using mythology as a guide. And he was looking at myths around the world, and he noticed a common pattern in how many hero stories play out. So he saw the same thing happening in Navajo mythology, that was going on in Greek mythology, and he thought this was really interesting. So he really came up with the concept of the hero's cycle, the hero's journey. It's got a couple of names. Some people call it the hero's journey, the hero cycle, or I think James Joyce referred to it once as the monolith. And Carl, yeah. So from there, Carl Jung, the concept was picked up by mythologist Joseph Campbell, and he wrote this book here, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And from there, it fell into pop culture when a screenwriter in Hollywood or producer-director was fumbling around with his script, and he had no idea what the hell he was doing. He was writing something called The Star Wars. And I don't know if anybody's ever read early drafts of The Star Wars, but they're really bad rip-offs of Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress. Imagine the samurais, the robots and things. But, so he said many times he'd probably still be trying to figure out how to write that script if he hadn't stumbled onto Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. And I'll just go through the concept and different keys, and it'll probably start to sound really familiar, not just with Star Wars, but with hundreds of other movies that you've seen. So the pattern that both Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell spotted was this laid out in this cycle. This is gonna mess me up because it's plot-wise. Whenever I do these things, I sketch out a story beforehand. I just go counterclockwise. But anyway, that leadership. Cool. So the hero's journey starts off with the hero in the ordinary world somewhere. So everything, the status quo is balanced to a certain degree. There's problems in this world, but the hero is not really interested in engaging in changing his world in any way. Then somewhere in there, a voice comes from the other world, the special world. So that's what this line represents here. Everything above that line is the ordinary world. That's where the hero starts his adventure. and then something compels him on a journey to cross the threshold into the special world. So it's usually a voice from the other side. So what happens in Luke's world? Everything's fine, everything's going along just hunky-dory until these droids show up in his life, and they start to push him in another direction. And he needs some help. So someone else has to come into his life and help him to begin this adventure. So after meeting droids, after meeting the agent from the other world, then he connects with a mentor. So he finds Obi-Wan Kenobi, and they begin the adventure. And then as they progress, they come towards this threshold. The threshold is where the hero crosses into the other world. And this is an idea that's really well reflected in old nursery stories or Bowden stories. There's, when it's the ogre in the woods, or like Peg Powder, who lives in the river. Mother says, don't go down by the river. Peg Powder will grab you by the leg and pull you in. So she's the threshold guardian. So we all know it's nonsense, but in order to grow up, you have to get past the monster in the woods. So that's the first one. And in defeating or overcoming the first threshold, the hero gains some sort of ability or magic power. Not sure how that's reflected in Star Wars, but I have great old stories where the ogre was, I can't diverge too much. This is usually part of like a 4-hour workshop that I give, so I tend to go off on all these different things. Anyway, sorry, bring it back. So after the hero crosses the threshold, they come into a series of tasks and challenges and helpers that come into it. And bit by bit, they get progressively worse and worse. So in mythology, it's like the labors of Hercules, or the tasks of the Navajo heroes, or something like that. There's always just sort of like, first the hero does this, and then they do this, and then they make, it might be, there's old children's stories where the girl is going through the woods, and she finds the bee that's stuck in the spider web, and she takes the bee out of the spider web, and then goes on, and there's somebody else, and they got this little problem, and they help her. And then somewhere, 1,000 bees come back to help her, or something like that. So, but it's always a series of tasks that are helping the hero grow in some way. I think Finding Nemo is perhaps one of the most amazing models of the hero's journey. As Nemo starts off with, in his world that's been shattered, he's very scared of everything. And that's what's warping his world. And his whole journey, things keep getting worse and worse because he's always reacting to things from a place of fear. So, as the hero gets deeper and deeper into this special world, they come to the abyss, death and rebirth. So, this is typically the worst thing that can happen in the creator's universe. I always think it's interesting to be watching a movie or something and see what they come up with for the nadir, the bottom right. Like, on the first Star Wars, what was it? Let's take our heroes and put them in the Death Star. Where in the Death Star? How about the penitentiary section of the Death Star? No, wait. How about a trash compactor in the penitentiary section of the Death Star? And we'll throw in one other thing. So yeah, the absolute worst place in the whole thing. And then, having gone through that, they seize the prize, and they go through a transformation. In Luke's case, I think it's the death of Obi-Wan. That's kind of that's as bad as the case. They've gone through all this. They've gone through all these tests and challenges together, and then now he's on his own. He's in this lonely place. And this part here is what the hero comes out with. So how is the hero transformed after all the challenges and all the traumas that they've gone through? what have they become and where are they going after this? So there's a lot of different themes that come into play here. Sometimes Campbell talks about the magic flight. So the whole adventure is just taking place, somebody's just stolen the treasure from the monster, now they have to run away. Maybe they're on a flying carpet or something, or escaping. So, they're returning to the ordinary world now that they have the prize, the elixir. Sometimes referred to as something that's going to transform and change the nature of the ordinary world. So now that they've got it, they're getting out of there like a bad idea. But there's one last challenge. There's one thing that the hero has to do, and they have to take into, they have to have internalized all of the transformations that they've come up against, that they've gone through up to this point. So this is Star Wars, the destruction of the Death Star. And it's manifested the way Luke decides to rely on the Force. In that moment, he decides to set aside technology, he decides to set aside everything that was safe and stable for him up until that point, and then just believe completely in himself and the Force and his newfound connection with the universe. So as he crosses back into so with the final challenge out of the way, using his newfound powers that he derives through all of this, the Death Star is destroyed, and the world is renewed. It becomes something new. There's a new status quo now. So the hero returns to the ordinary world, and the world itself is changed because of his adventure. Now the interesting thing about the cycle too is it's kind of nestable as an idea. Like if you think about the entire original trilogy of Star Wars, all three films can fit in here to a large degree. You could say the first one is simply Luke's call to becoming a Jedi. So you could say, well, the first one starts here and kind of ends here or something like that. And then the Empire Strikes Back takes us way down to the worst of the worst place where, got a hand chopped off. He's found out some really bad news about his dad. And his new friends. I'm getting 5 minutes. So yeah, all of his new friends are just had their butts kicked and everything. So he's coming out of this. And then we're into Return of the Jedi, which gives us the final challenge, and then the return, and yet another status quo is established. So in each of the movies, you can see the cycle, and all together you can see the cycle. And if you want to, you can even include those prequels. I don't know why you want to, but you can think about them all 6 together as well. They really drop the ball. Anyway, it's another digression. So where this kind of got me in trouble once, I was really excited to try and insinuate my way into the game world, and I wanted to write about some of these ideas and how they could make games better. And I wrote a couple of articles on GameSutra.com. I don't know if that's still in there, but the first one I wrote was introducing people to this concept and talking tough about how it could really bring in a whole other level of engagement to stories. And I think within about 2 or 3 hours, somebody had written a counter article that just completely ripped me a new one. And the argument was basically, stories in games suck. They always suck. Somebody was doing like cutscenes and cheap scenes. I just remember one of the zingers that he gave me that sort of flat. What did he say? He said, I think it was a closing line of his argument. He said, games have to be inherently fun, and nobody cares how much subtext there is in the dialogue tree. But someone, but somewhere in his argument, he said something that really, really piqued my interest. He said, you know what has no story to it? Chess. You know what's a really fun game? Chess. It's been around forever. It's never had a story. And I had to think about that. And I was like, story maybe not. But narrative, there's definitely a narrative to chess. So I'm kind of making a distinction there between narrative and story. The story is really something that you absorb passively. It's something you're taken through. Somebody takes your hand and takes you through a story. But narrative is to story as house is to home. That's one way you could look at it. It's like, what is the experience? So somebody's really giving you the experience of a story when you're watching a movie or reading a book. But narrative is something you might extract on your own from a game. So the next article I wrote on Game Sutra to counter his was called The Invisible Narrative of Games, or The Story of Chess. Stuck right in the eye. And so my thesis in that one was, well, chess, yeah, it has a story. You got all these pieces, they all have names, they have characters in your story, and there's 3 acts to a chess game as well. There's, it's the beginning, you're sitting down. There's the conquering of the center of the chessboard, and that's this part here. And then there's the denouement. You can look at it as really 3-act structure. The denouement and the tilting of the king. Somebody submits in the game. Oh, checkmate. Like the king is knocked over. Now, is it really the narrative that makes it more fun and interesting? Well, think about checkers. I don't know about you, but I was done with checkers when I was 10 years old. It was just boring. I was like, oh, I lost all my little pucks, did I? Okay. But I tell you, any time I lose my queen in chess, it is Shakespearean, the experience I'm going through. It's like, oh, I lost it. So, yeah, I think it's a really powerful narrative at work in chess, and that whole idea tells me that that games have narrative elements that none of the other storytelling methods have. So, subtext, he's right, subtext. Okay, fine. 10 before, now it's fine. Okay. So, yeah, games have these other elements, these ludic elements, that none of the others have. And so, since I had that epiphany, I've been looking at games and saying, well, where is the narrative in these things? And somebody might put in front of me and say something like Minecraft. As there's no story there, they just give you this world, it's completely randomly generated, and you do your thing in there. Well, no, I see a narrative in there. I think it's very cunningly embedded, whether they meant it or not. It's very cunningly embedded in the whole crafting. Right? So you have to. You can only go so far without crafting up to the next level, and then you reach certain levels of crafting ability, opening up worlds, opening doors to other worlds. And then there's one of these worlds, it's the most difficult one to get to. It's called the end. So I definitely think that's a very, very cunning way of embedding narrative into a game. So I rushed through all that, and that may be all I have to say. Yeah, how about that? 4 hours and a half an hour. Okay. Yeah. So, anyways, I'm keeping my eyes open for all of these things, and I think as games go on change, this is the what do they call it? Narrative designer position is actually going to get more important to finding new ways of engaging players. That's what I got. Any questions?
Okay, we're going to keep it to a few questions, just maybe 2, 3 questions, and we'll move on to the next one.
So in terms of crafting a narrative, do you find it's easier to start with a broad scope? Like, is that where you would start as creative, or like when you're trying to tell a story, what's a good starting point?
I think we start with drawing the circle and a line through it, line through the middle. And whenever I'm writing a story or developing a script or something like that, sometimes you might have an idea which sounds really cool, but is it a story yet? And it's my first place that I go to, and once I figure out kind of the keys roughly that feel right to me, that okay, I've got somebody, and they have this one impression, they have this one impression of the world, and how are they going to change? What are they going to go through to change and get to the other side? So actually, I did it for this talk. These are all my notes, and this is where I started. And so I wasn't quite sure how I was going to start this talk. I was going to start with my own personal experience in the industry, because that's what I did. And then, I figured out what I needed to say, all the points that I needed to say to really transform all of the people in this room into something completely different. That's generally the approach. And if I can hit all those points, then I know I have a story and not just a cool idea.
So with your example of chess and Minecraft, I think what I took from that is basically you have to use your imagination and come up with something yourself as well.
Yeah, well, I just thought it was a new way of thinking for me. I've used the hero cycle in kind of unconventional ways before. Once when I was making a documentary, I wrote it, and I was like, well, I'm not following anybody's story in this documentary. But it was a documentary about the fairies of folklore. And I was like, okay, there's no hero in the story. It's a bunch of little stories all together. So how's this going to work? So what I did was I said, oh, the audience is the hero. So I put them in the hero seat, and I said, okay, I'm going to take them on a journey through this whole thing. And I guess I'm only about to and I'm taking them through it. So in a fairy documentary, I started off with really benign kind of fairies, these house spirits, brownies, and stuff like that. And then they got became tricksters, and they just got weirder and darker. And the final one, the worst point, was something called the Nicolaby, Scottish horror, monstrous nightmare thing from Skinless. Anyway, it was the worst example of a fairy that I could remember. It was horrifying. And then after that, we talked about the origins of fairies. This is a part where I always like to. Campbell gets into it a lot more detail, but this is a connection with the divine. This is where the hero realizes that they're connected to a bigger story, something bigger, way bigger than themselves. So they went through all that, and now they connect themselves. And so I think it would be interesting. I've never had a chance to experiment with these ideas, but what could you put your player through that might make them think differently? Start them off in something we're going to take them. What's the worst thing you could do with them in the context of your game? Whatever you're developing. Minecraft is, I guess, just together. It's almost like that halfway point, so that's kind of down here. But then you get to the end, maybe that's the threshold. So if you want to get back and just say, okay, I've done this, the end. I'm speculating there, but they probably would think it through on this next cycle, but you can make some parallels.
I guess what I was curious about is what you find is like the most difficult part of writing out of the whole hero's journey, and how do you get over that?
What's the most difficult part of it?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's whenever I'm developing a story, I always sort of go away and come back to it. If I say, well, here's this cool idea, I've got this part up here, and I got some of this over here. What's the point of the story? I'm not going to try to go any further with it until I figure that out. So some of this, go through my sketchbooks, you'll see tons of these circles, like with half-developed ideas. I don't agree with this. So. But that's also a good thing too. It just tells me not to waste my time on that idea. Or maybe I'll clue in at another point. So come up with something later on and add to it.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
I wrote it down just to make sure I remember how to say it. Would you say machinimas might be a good example of game story? Because technically, machinimas, basically they use the video games themselves to basically create film. in
Oh, really?
essence. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for a big example would be like Red vs. Blue, which uses Halo, and they use basically the game itself to create a story from there. Like they use the camera work in the game and everything from there, and add their own voice acting.
Okay.
And I was just thinking, machinimas in a sense are that idea of story where they take a very basic game like that and then make a story from it, precisely, like especially over YouTube and everything like that. So I was just wondering maybe if that might be a good example of, say, using the hero's journey in, say, a video game.
Okay. I mean, I've never seen one of those, but if they're engaging, I always find if I hear a story which is engaging, it's really grabbing, I think they've tapped into this in some way, whether they meant to or not. There are some writers, like Robert McKee, who wrote a book called Story, screenwriters, and he goes on with great lengths about how to write a screenplay. He never touches this. And but when I look at his structure for a screenplay, it's a 3-act thing with a mid-act reversal in the second act. Well, that looks exactly like what we got here. It's like Act 1, Act 2, mid-act reversal, Act 3. So. Anyway, yeah, and he goes to great lengths to work around it and not give it any credit whatsoever. I think he's got a bit of hate on for it, but somehow it seems to come back to the same principles.
Thank you.